engine of the old Ford pickup coughed once, then died, leaving Daniel Brooks in the sudden vast silence of the Chugach National Forest. He sat there for a long moment, hands still gripping the steering wheel, the worn plastic cool beneath his calloused palms. Outside, the world was a riot of green and gray. Towering spruces reached for a perpetually overcast sky, the distant muted roar of a river a low, constant hum beneath the chirping of unseen birds. This was it. Alaska. The edge of nowhere. His new beginning. It was a deeper nowhere. He climbed out, stretching his 43-year-old body. Every joint in his back protested with a soft groan. The air, crisp and cold even in the late summer, filled his lungs with the scent of pine needles, wet earth, and something ancient, wild, and untamed. It was a good smell, a clean smell, a smell that scraped away the grit of the city he'd left behind, the lingering stink of hospitals and legal offices. He pulled his duffel from the truck bed, its canvas heavy with the sparse possessions he deemed worthy of this new solitary life. The small ranger cabin, set back from a winding dirt road, was exactly as it had appeared in the grainy photos. A squat, timber-framed structure with a wisp of smoke curling lazily from its stone chimney, already lit by the previous occupant. His days settled into a rhythm, slow and deliberate, a counterpoint to the chaotic tempo of his past. He patrolled the trails, checking boundary markers, clearing fallen branches with the rhythmic thud of an axe, the smell of freshly cut wood sharp and invigorating. He repaired a rickety footbridge over a babbling brook, his hands calloused and capable, finding a quiet satisfaction in the work. Each task was simple, tangible, a small victory against the encroaching wilderness. He observed the elk, including magnificent bulls whose antlers shone like polished dark wood, grazing in the shadowed clearings, their movements unhurried and peaceful. He watched the light filter through the dense canopy, painting shifting patterns on the forest floor, each ray a brushstroke of transient beauty. He learned the subtle shifts of the wind, the language of the rustling leaves, the precise angle of the sun that meant twilight was just an hour away. The forest, in its immense indifference, became a kind of balm. It demanded nothing, offered no judgment, simply existed, and in that existence Daniel found a fleeting peace. But the nights were different. The quiet of the cabin, broken only by the crackle of the wood stove, became a chamber for the echoes. The dreams came, sharp and vivid, smelling of dust and cordite. He was back there, the searing heat of the desert sun on his neck, the relentless buzz of flies around the body of a fallen comrade. The metallic tang of blood filled his mouth. He'd wake with a gasp, his heart hammering against his ribs, the taste of rust and fear a bitter coating on his tongue. He heard the faint crackle of a rifle, the screams of the wounded, the distant, dull thud of an improvised explosive device. His body was slick with sweat, his muscles tense, still bracing for impact. The civilian world, with its soft beds and silent nights, couldn't erase the imprint of war. Each morning he'd stare at his reflection in the small, smudged mirror above the sink, a stranger looking back, his eyes distant, cynical, haunted. Then came the other echoes, the ones from after the war, the quieter, more insidious ones. The sterile white walls of the divorce lawyer's office, the hollow timbre of his wife's voice, explaining calmly, rationally, that she couldn't live with the man he had become. She found comfort elsewhere, in a man who didn't flinch at loud noises, who didn't stare blankly into the middle distance during dinner, who could still hold a conversation without his mind drifting back to the dust and the blood. He remembered the sickening lurch in his gut, not just from the betrayal, but from the sudden, profound loneliness. And then the child, his child. The image of a small hand, soft and warm, slipping from his grasp. The silence of a phone that no longer rang. The quiet certainty that he'd lost that connection forever. This forest, he knew, was not just a job. It was an escape. A self-imposed exile from a world that had become too loud, too demanding, too full of painful memories. In this self-made isolation, there was one constant, one warm, breathing presence that kept the deepest chill at bay. His husky, a sleek, intelligent creature named Jax, was a stray he'd found as a pup years ago, shivering in a ditch during a brutal Wyoming winter. Their bond was deep, silent, forged in countless miles of shared silence, an unspoken understanding that transcended words. Jax knew his moods. He gave a low growl when the nightmares came, and offered a gentle nudge of his wet nose against Daniel's hand when the melancholy settled in. Jax lay patiently by the wood stove, his eyes following Daniel's movements, an intuitive psychotherapist wrapped in a coat of gray and white fur. The dog's presence was a tether to something real, something uncomplicated, something that simply was, without judgment or expectation. He watched Jax chase squirrels through the underbrush, a blur of joyful energy, and curl up by his feet at night, a warm weight against his calves, a silent guardian against the encroaching emptiness. The vast, untamed expanse of the Chugach slowly, incrementally, began its subtle work. It was not a sudden cure, but a gradual erosion of the sharp edges of his trauma. The sheer, overwhelming scale of the wilderness dwarfed his personal demons. The majestic sweep of the mountains, their peaks capped with eternal snow, put his own suffering into humbling perspective. The clean, biting air, especially in the mornings, scrubbed the inside of his lungs. The rich, earthy smell of the forest floor, the damp moss, the resinous pine sap, filled his head, leaving less room for the metallic stench of memory. He'd spend hours watching a cow moose and her calf forage by a glacial stream, their movements graceful, ancient. The silence here was not empty. It was full of the quiet hum of life, the rustle of unseen creatures, the whisper of the wind through the needles. Here, amongst the wild, he was just another organism, another set of eyes observing the endless cycle of life and death. And in that anonymity, he found a fragile, fleeting peace. His daily patrols were more than just routine. They were a constant application of the skills etched into his very being. His father, a man of few words but profound knowledge, had taught him to read the forest as a worn book. He told the age of a deer by the depth of its tracks, predicted a coming storm by the shift in the wind's direction and the scent of rain on the air, and navigated by the slant of sunlight through the trees and the immutable positions of the stars at night. His senses, honed by years of hunting with his father and then by the brutal necessities of war, were sharper than most. He discerned the faint crackle of a twig from a mile away and caught the subtle shift in a scent that indicated an animal or human had passed recently. The forest was not just a place he worked. It was an extension of himself, a complex tapestry of information he interpreted, a realm where he felt, for the first time in years, truly alive and truly competent. Every patrol was a reaffirmation of who he was, deep down, beneath the layers of trauma and regret. He was a tracker, a survivor, a man of the wild. And in the heart of this wild, he thought, he had finally found his sanctuary. The scent hit him first, a coppery tang of death, heavy and cloying even through the crisp Alaskan air. It was not the usual smell of carrion, not quite. There was something else in it, a subtle undertone of something sickly sweet, like decay that had gone wrong. Daniel's gut tightened. He pulled Jax closer, the husky's ears swiveling, nose twitching, a low, inquisitive whine rumbling in its chest. They were deep on the northern edge of his sector, a place where the forest grew particularly dense, the light barely penetrating the thick canopy of spruce and hemlock. He kept his hand near the holster of his sidearm, its weight a familiar comfort. Then he saw it. A grizzly bear, massive, easily 700 pounds, lay sprawled on its side, a dark, motionless hulk against the pale green moss. His first thought was poachers. It was always poachers, especially this deep in. But as he drew closer, the scene before him made his blood run cold. This was not a poaching kill. The bear was not torn apart, not scavenged. Instead, its chest cavity had been opened with horrifying precision. The hide was cleanly severed, the ribs delicately splayed outwards. A master surgeon had been at work. Internal organs, some were missing, cleanly removed, but others remained, still glistening wetly in the dim light. It was a dissection, not a kill. The sheer, deliberate artistry of it chilled him more than any savage ripping. He circled the immense body, his eyes scanning the immediate area. No signs of a struggle. No torn earth, no broken branches, no frantic claw marks on the surrounding trees that would indicate a life-or-death battle with another large animal. Usually, a bear fight left a battlefield of destruction. This was unnervingly pristine, and no fur. Not a single tuft of grizzly hair caught on a thorny bush or stuck to the damp moss, which was impossible if another predator had been involved. Instead, he found them. Footprints. Not paw prints, but the clear, deep impressions of hiking boots, size large, several sets, indicating more than one person. They were precise, careful, not the hurried, stumbling tracks of men fleeing a kill. And then, subtle, almost invisible, thin cuts on the bark of the nearest trees, like deep razor incisions glinting wetly in the faint light. Not random marks, but deliberate, precise slashes, mirroring the unnerving precision of the bear's wound. The strangeness deepened with the next observation. The sheer waste of it. The hide, thick and valuable, had been left behind. The valuable claws, the skull, the meat, all abandoned. This was not how poachers operated. Poachers risked their lives for profit, for the trophy. They did not leave behind hundreds of pounds of valuable goods to rot. This was not sloppy work. It was something else entirely. Something he could not grasp, something that twisted his stomach into a knot. It felt like a message, a ritual, rather than a crime. A cold dread, slow and creeping, began to seep into his bones, far deeper than any fear he felt for mere human poachers. He pulled out his satellite phone, the familiar weight in his hand a momentary comfort. It felt wrong to call, a breaking of an unspoken code of the wilderness, but he had to. He contacted the local police detachment, a sleepy outfit 20 miles down the highway, and then his own supervisor at the Park Service. He described the scene with meticulous detail, his observations, his suspicions. He heard the skepticism in their voices, the veiled annoyance at being bothered. Probably a couple of aggressive bears, Ranger Brooks, his supervisor, drawled, and some very foolish poachers. We'll send someone eventually. The police, equally unenthusiastic, promised the same vague dispatch. He felt the cold shoulder, the dismissal. They did not hear the horror in his voice. They simply chose not to hear it. They treated it like a nuisance call, not a chilling crime scene. 3 days bled into 4, and no one showed. The sun rose and set, painting the peaks in hues of gold and purple, but no police cruiser, no Park Service truck rumbled down the dirt road. The silence from headquarters was absolute. No follow-up calls, no reports of other illegal activity, no rumors of strange hunters. The forest had swallowed the incident whole, leaving Daniel alone with his unsettling discovery. The lack of response, the inexplicable quiet after such a gruesome find, only fueled his suspicions. His superiors were either utterly incompetent, or they deliberately ignored something. They knew something they were not telling him. The thought, cold and sharp, burrowed deep into his mind. On the 4th day, unable to bear the inaction, Daniel returned to the scene. The smell of decay was stronger now, a sickly sweet cloud hanging heavy in the still air. He circled the area again, pushing further out this time, his eyes sweeping the underbrush, his senses on high alert. 2 miles north, nestled in a small, rocky hollow, he found them. Human remains, but not just remains. Dispersed, shattered pieces of what were once bodies, torn and mangled beyond recognition. Bones lay splintered, flesh ripped clean from bone by some immense, horrific force. A tattered piece of denim, a fragment of a boot sole, were the only things that hinted at their humanity. The scene was carnage, on a scale that made the bear's precise dissection almost gentle. He gagged, the sour taste of bile rising in his throat, memories of desert battlefields flashing unbidden in his mind. But this was worse, far worse, and again, the most terrifying detail. The perfect, chilling absence of blood. The earth beneath the scattered remains was dry, undisturbed. No pooling, no splatters, no crimson stains on the leaves and the rocks. Whatever had done this had not only killed but had consumed every drop of blood, leaving behind only the desiccated remnants of bone and sinew. This was not a bear attack. He knew that with bone-deep certainty. Bears left blood, left scattered fur, left their clumsy, brutal marks. Wolves were messy, leaving trails of gore. This was something else. Something clean, efficient, and utterly horrifying. The image of the precisely cut bear, the absence of blood, the chilling exactitude of the violence, solidified in his mind. It was not a bear. When the police finally arrived, days later this time, their faces grim but unreadable, they took one look, muttered something about a very large, aggressive bear, and 2, scribbled a few notes, and swiftly closed the case. The section of the forest was temporarily closed, a perfunctory gesture. But Daniel knew. He knew with a cold, absolute certainty that it was not a bear, and the knowledge festered, a dark, unsettling seed in his mind. The official pronouncement hung in the air like a pall. Several aggressive bears. The phrase was echoed by his supervisor, then repeated in the local news, a neat, convenient explanation for the horror Daniel had witnessed. A temporary closure of the northern sector. Life would return to normal, but Daniel would not believe it. His gut, honed by years of walking the line between order and chaos, screamed otherwise. He'd seen the aftermath of violence, both human and animal, in countless forms. He knew the difference between the clumsy, powerful rage of a grizzly and the chilling, surgical precision he'd found. His army experience had taught him to trust his instincts above all else, to look beyond the surface, to question convenient narratives. This was not the work of animals. This was something else, something deliberate, something unnatural. Over the next few weeks, Daniel began his own investigation, a clandestine operation shrouded in the vast, indifferent anonymity of the forest. By day, he was the diligent park ranger, patching fences, clearing trails, interacting with the few hardy tourists who ventured so far north. His demeanor was calm, professional, betraying nothing of the churning obsession beneath. But as dusk bled into the long Alaskan nights, his true work began. His old military pack, long since retired from the sands of Iraq, was resurrected, filled not with combat gear but with a new kind of arsenal. He sought what others had missed and what they'd deliberately ignored. He used his old Army field craft, the lessons learned from Special Operations Forces sergeants, blending seamlessly with the survival skills his father had imparted. He acquired several small, rugged, motion-activated cameras, the kind hunters used to track game. He meticulously positioned them on trees in the areas where the bear and the human remains had been found, and on the game trails leading in and out of those zones. He spent hours camouflaging them, weaving local moss and bark around their lenses, ensuring they blended seamlessly with the rough textures of the trees. He checked his work obsessively, stepping back, squinting, until they were almost invisible to the naked eye. The quiet click of the shutter, the almost imperceptible red glow of the night vision, were sounds he came to know intimately. To tempt whatever lurked in the shadows, Daniel began to leave baits, small pieces of meat, including the carcass of a squirrel or rabbit he'd found, far from any established trails or human traffic. He knew the risks. Attracting large predators was dangerous, but he was beyond conventional fears. He placed them carefully, noting their positions on a specialized global positioning system unit, checking them every few days. He looked for anomalies, for anything that defied the natural order, for a sign that whatever had done this was still out there, hungry. The smell of the raw meat, pungent and earthy, hung in the cold air, a silent invitation to something unseen. Weeks bled into months, each day a slow, deliberate crawl towards the unknown. The nights in the forest became a second life, a secret existence. He slept little, his sleep fractured by dreams that now twisted the horrors of war with images of mangled flesh and inexplicable absence of blood. His nerves, already frayed by years of unaddressed trauma, stretched thinner and thinner like taut wires ready to snap. He hiked for miles under the cold moonlight, Jax a silent, steady presence beside him, his eyes constantly sweeping the darkness, his ears strained for any sound that was not the natural symphony of the wilderness. He reviewed the camera footage with grim determination. Hundreds of hours of swaying branches, scampering rodents and the occasional deer or moose. Nothing. The baits remained untouched, or if disturbed, it was clearly the work of a fox or a wolverine. A creeping doubt began to gnaw at him. The police were right. It had been just a very large, exceptionally aggressive bear. An anomaly. After all, the forest held a million secrets. The psychological pressure mounted, a relentless, invisible weight. The isolation, once a source of comfort, now felt a curse. There was no one to confide in, no one who would believe him. His post-traumatic stress disorder, a constant companion, began to manifest with renewed intensity. The nightmares became more vivid, more physically draining. The line between dream and waking reality blurred. He found himself staring into the dense woods, convinced that a pair of unseen eyes were watching him from the depths of the shadows. The familiar sounds of the forest, the rustle of leaves, the snap of a branch, the hoot of an owl, now imbued with a sinister undertone, each one a harbinger of something dreadful. He checked his rifle, then rechecked it, the cool metal a momentary comfort against the burgeoning unease. And it was the silence, paradoxically, that became the most unsettling. This prolonged, unnatural quiet, this absolute absence of the creature he was hunting, pressed down on him with crushing force. Predators did not simply vanish into thin air. They moved on, yes, but they left signs, rumors, a ripple of disturbance. This complete disappearance revealed something far more insidious: intelligence. It actively concealed its presence. And with that realization, a cold, hard drop of genuine fear solidified in his gut. It was not the fear of being attacked, not yet. It was the fear of being outwitted, of facing an adversary so cunning, so utterly beyond the grasp of human understanding, that it simply ceased to exist when it chose. The forest, once his sanctuary, felt less a wilderness and more a vast, patient trap. And he, Daniel Brooks, was slowly, inexorably being drawn into its silent, chilling depths. The day was overcast, the air damp and heavy with the promise of rain. Daniel, his shoulders aching from the constant weight of his pack and the gnawing fatigue of too many sleepless nights, was making his rounds, checking his hidden cameras. It had become a monotonous ritual, a futile exercise in hope. For weeks the footage had been nothing but the slow ballet of nature. Deer grazing, a fox darting through the undergrowth, the rhythmic swaying of branches in the wind. His disappointment had been a dull, constant ache. He expected nothing different this time. But as he connected the small viewing screen to the camera nestled deep in a gnarled spruce, his heart gave a sudden violent lurch against his ribs. The usual static-filled screen flickered, then resolved into an image. The timestamp in the corner glowed red. 3:17 a.m. Deep night. The northern boundary of his sector. He watched, holding his breath, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. And then it appeared. Not a blur, not a trick of light and shadow, but a distinct, undeniable silhouette. It was massive, far larger than any bear, taller than any man he'd ever seen, a solid 8 feet from its crouched, hunched posture. Its movements were fluid, silent, impossibly graceful for something of its size. It walked on 2 legs, but with a predatory, wolf-like carriage, its long arms hanging low, almost brushing the ground. Its fur, thick and shaggy, absorbed the meager available light, appearing utterly black against the monochromatic night vision. This was no animal. This was something else. Its shape was a nightmare made real. The creature did not wander. It moved with clear purpose, a dark, unstoppable force flowing through the dense underbrush. And then Daniel's blood ran cold. It turned. Its massive head swiveled, and it looked directly at the camera. He felt irrationally that it looked directly at him through the lens, across the miles of forest, through the screen of the viewer. He saw no details in the black and white image, just the implied knowledge in that turn of the head. It paused for a chilling second, a beat that stretched into an eternity, studying the device, understanding its purpose. Then, with a sudden, devastating swiftness, a massive hand reached out, The camera bucked once, violently, a crunch of snapping plastic, and the screen went black, replaced by a dull, blank static. Daniel stared at the dead screen, his hands trembling so violently he almost dropped the viewer. His breath hitched in his throat. His mind, trained for logical assessment, struggled to process what he had seen. It was no hallucination, no trick of the light. But the image had been too clear, the destruction too deliberate. That was not an animal reacting to a strange object. That was something intelligent. Something that understood what the camera was and chose to destroy it. It was thinking. It was aware. The cold sweat that slicked his palms was not from exertion. It was from a profound existential terror. The thought of reporting it flashed through his mind, bright and fleeting, a spark in the dark. Then, just as quickly, it died. What would he say? I saw a giant werewolf on my trail camera, and it broke it deliberately. They would laugh him out of the Park Service. They'd send him to the nearest Veterans Affairs hospital for a psych evaluation. They'd say his post-traumatic stress disorder had finally taken root. He knew the bureaucratic machinery too well. His previous reports about the grizzly and the human remains had been dismissed, ignored, explained away. Who would believe him now? He was alone in this, absolutely, terrifyingly alone. He made a decision then, cold and swift, born of years of military training and a deep-seated distrust of authority. This was no longer a poaching investigation. This was something far more dangerous, far more fundamental. He was staring into the void, and the void was staring back. He would deal with this alone. He would do it his way. The thought brought a strange, grim clarity to his mind, a sense of grim purpose that had been missing since his return from overseas. He began to quietly, methodically, acquire new equipment. He leveraged old Army connections, made hushed calls, used untraceable online channels, night vision optics, not the cheap commercial variety, but military-grade infrared scopes that could pierce the darkest night. Ultra-sensitive motion detectors responded to minute changes in air pressure, body heat, and even subtle ground vibrations. High-definition recording devices, hardened against the elements. He spent a small fortune, liquidating the last of his savings, feeling the cold, familiar thrill of preparing for an unseen enemy. He built a new network, a true intelligence grid, designed to track something that defied rational explanation. His cabin, once a sanctuary, slowly transformed into a tactical command center, maps spread across his rough-hewn table, a meticulous web of data points and ambush sites. Daniel was not obsessed in the traditional sense, not driven by a feverish madness. His actions were precise, logical, chillingly methodical, a general planning a complex military operation. He began to set up traps, not to capture, but to track, to funnel the creature, to learn its movements and habits. He constructed concealed observation posts, blending them seamlessly into the dense foliage, preparing for long, silent vigils. He was no longer just a park ranger. He was a hunter, yes, but a new kind of hunter. His goal was not simply destruction, but understanding. The forest, once a place of healing, had become his battleground, and he, Daniel Brooks, was ready to wage a silent, lonely war against the unknown. The knowledge that something ancient and monstrous lurked within these woods had replaced his old nightmares with a chilling, tangible reality. With his new tools, Daniel delved deeper into the shadowed heart of the Chugach. His nocturnal forays became increasingly audacious. His days were a blur of routine ranger duties, his nights a meticulous, obsessive pursuit. He spent hours hunched over the glowing screens of his infrared cameras, reviewing footage, fast-forwarding through countless hours of rustling leaves and scampering wildlife. He calibrated his highly sensitive microphones, listening to the vast, complex symphony of the forest, straining to catch any sound that did not belong, any anomaly in the natural order. His eyes burned, his body ached with chronic fatigue, but the cold fire of his determination kept him going. Jax, ever present, whined softly, sensing the intensity, the shift in his master's focus. Months of this painstaking work began to yield a terrifying clarity. Daniel started to see a pattern, a chilling rhythm in the creature's elusive appearances. It emerged roughly every 27 to 30 days, a cycle that correlated uncannily with the lunar phases. Its activity was concentrated within a specific, geographically defined quadrant of the forest, a roughly circular area with a radius of 10 miles. It became clear it avoided certain natural features. Major rivers acted as impassable barriers. Their rushing waters were a deterrent. High, jagged mountain ridges also marked an unseen boundary. The creature considered them beyond its domain and beneath its notice. It was a territory, vast and wild, but a territory nonetheless. The creature, he realized, was not merely a brute force of nature. It hunted, yes, but its kills were purposeful, efficient. He found the remains of deer, moose, even another bear, always in places that showed they had been taken for sustenance, not sport. This was not senseless violence. It was the calculated behavior of a predator that killed to survive. It was not random. The creature did not stumble into his traps. It actively avoided them. He'd meticulously laid out tripwires connected to remote sensors, camouflaged pressure plates, but the footage showed the creature veering subtly, silently around them, its immense form flowing past just outside the trigger zone. It knew what they were. It understood their purpose. Every so often, Daniel stumbled upon something else. Something even more unsettling than the creature's intelligence. Strange marks. Triangles, constructed with an uncanny precision, formed from carefully placed stones on the forest floor and etched into the bark of ancient trees. Entire trees were toppled, arranged in configurations that were too deliberate, too symbolic to be accidental. These were not random acts of nature and not the clumsy work of animals. They were too precise, too meaningful. They were deliberate communication, territory markers, and something even deeper. He ran his fingers over the rough bark where the marks were scored, a chill tracing its way up his arm. It was language. It was intent. Gradually, insidiously, a chilling realization began to settle over Daniel. His relentless hunt had transformed into something else entirely. It became less a pursuit and more an unspoken dialogue, a grim, silent game. He found these strange markings, these arranged stones, and a cold certainty descended upon him. The creature knew he was there. It knew about his cameras, his traps, his every methodical step. It left him clues. Not warnings exactly, but something far more unsettling. A chilling acknowledgement of his presence. A grim invitation to continue the dance. The forest, vast and indifferent, was now charged with an unseen observer, its ancient eyes watching his every move. The suspense became a constant companion, a dull ache beneath his ribs. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a distant branch, every shift in the wind was a deliberate signal, a precursor to the creature's appearance. His heart hammered constantly, a frantic drumbeat against the silence of the woods. He checked his rifle, the cold steel familiar in his hands. But a part of him knew with bone-deep certainty that it would be utterly useless against this creature. The sheer scale, the impossible intelligence, the silent power of it. The weapon was a comfort, an instinct, but not a solution. And with the growing certainty of its observation, Daniel began to deduce. The creature was intelligent enough to understand his cameras, to avoid his traps, and to leave these cryptic marks. It was not just a hyper-evolved animal. It was something else. Something possessing a non-human intellect, ancient and profound. It left him clues and played a game. It was not just observing him. It studied him. It assessed him, just as he attempted to assess it. The horrifying realization settled over him, a shroud of Arctic mist. He, Daniel Brooks, was not the hunter. He had become the hunted. Not yet physically, no, but in every other way that mattered. The chilling implication hung heavy in the air, transforming the wild beauty of the Shugach into a vast, silent, and incredibly dangerous testing ground. And he, the veteran, the survivor, was now the unsuspecting quarry in a game he barely understood. The air had been still, thick with the scent of damp earth and late summer pine. It was a regular patrol. Midday, the sun a pale disk behind a veil of clouds, filtering through the dense canopy in shifting patterns of light and shadow. Daniel, for once, was not expecting anything out of the ordinary. His mind was on the loose trail markers by Bear Creek, the chill in the air promising an early autumn. Jax trotted ahead, nose to the ground, sniffing out the endless mysteries of the forest. Then the world tilted. Not physically, but in the way reality warps when confronted with the impossible. There it was. 20 yards ahead, partially obscured by a stand of ancient spruce, stood the creature. Not a blur on a screen, not a distant shadow caught in a lens flare, but undeniably, terrifyingly real. A presence that sucked the air from the lungs, a silent, vast weight of primordial being. It was immense. A solid 8.5 feet tall, nearly 9, its head brushing the lowest branches of the old-growth trees. Its entire body was covered in coarse, matted fur, a mottled gray-brown that absorbed the light around it. Its chest was impossibly broad, the barrel of a prize bull, its powerful muscles rippling beneath the shaggy pelt even in stillness. Its arms, thick as tree trunks, hung low, ending in immense clawed hands capable of tearing steel. A primal terror, cold and sharp, lanced through Daniel's veins. This was the thing that had dissected the grizzly, that had torn the men apart with such horrific precision. But it was the eyes that truly froze him. They were set deep within its massive, wolf-like face. Not glowing, not monstrous, but ancient. They held a depth that transcended animal instinct, a detached, melancholic wisdom that spoke of eons. They were fixed on him, steady and unwavering, observing, assessing. They were not the eyes of a beast driven by hunger and rage. They were the eyes of something old, something patient, something that had seen countless generations of men come and go. And then, the most incomprehensible, soul-chilling part of the encounter. Jax. His loyal, fiercely protective husky who growled at the hint of a distant coyote who barked furiously at a squirrel in the yard, did not bark. He did not growl. Instead, the dog let out a soft, low whine, a sound of recognition, and then, impossibly, his tail gave a tentative wag. His head tilted, his intelligent blue eyes fixed on the creature, a bizarre, utterly non-threatening curiosity in their depths. It was a dog greeting an old, unusual friend. This reaction, more than the creature's impossible presence, more than its terrifying size, tore a gaping hole in Daniel's carefully constructed reality. It was a betrayal of everything he thought he knew about fear, about prey, about instinct. The creature made no move. It simply stood there, a silent, immovable monolith, holding Daniel's gaze. The distance between them, those 20 yards, was an immense chasm, yet also intimately close. The air crackled with unspoken understanding, a chilling, profound connection. Those few seconds stretched into an eternity, filled with a dialogue that had no words, a grim exchange of knowledge that passed directly between them. There was no aggression, no threat, just an unnerving, knowing observation. And in that moment, Daniel understood. It had known about him all along. Not just his cameras, not just his traps, but him. Every step he'd taken, every secret night patrol, every new piece of equipment. He had not been tracking it. It had been tracking him. He had been the object of study, a curious anomaly in its ancient domain. The forest was not his sanctuary, his hunting ground, and his battlefield. It was its territory, and he was merely a visitor, allowed to exist only by its unspoken decree. The entire narrative of his investigation, of his life in the forest, shattered around him like fragile glass. He was not the hunter. He was the quarry. Slowly, deliberately, without a sound, the creature turned. It did not bolt, did not vanish in a flash of speed. It simply pivoted its massive frame, its eyes never leaving Daniel's, and flowed back into the deep woods, melting into the shadows and the dense undergrowth, simply a part of the forest itself. It moved with a quiet dignity, a sense of having completed some profound, silent assessment. It was gone, yet its presence lingered, a cold, heavy weight in the air. Daniel remained standing, his hands shaking uncontrollably, a tremor running through his entire body. His heart pounded a frantic rhythm against his ribs. This was no longer merely the fear of a dangerous predator. This was an existential terror, a profound dread born of encountering something ancient, powerful, and intelligent enough to play with human beings, to observe them, to know them, all while remaining an invisible, untouchable force. The forest, once a place of healing, had transformed into a vast, silent, and infinitely patient trap, and he, Daniel Brooks, was nothing more than a pawn, an insignificant toy in a game he could barely comprehend, a game that had just begun. The direct encounter had shattered Daniel's world, leaving him with an unsettling, profound clarity. There was no going back to his old methods. The game was a game, and it had changed irrevocably. He spent the next few days in a quiet, almost meditative state, dismantling his entire surveillance network. Each camera he unstrapped from a tree, each sensor he carefully retrieved from its hidden placement, was a silent surrender, a physical act of relinquishing his futile hunt. The weight of the equipment in his hands felt different now, heavy with the burden of revelation. He put away his night vision optics, the cold gleam of their lenses a reminder of what he had seen. He stopped leaving baits. He abandoned his midnight patrols, the intricate mapping of the creature's movements. He no longer sought to catch or study it. He simply observed, now with his raw senses, a primal awareness replacing the cold logic of technology. He returned to the rhythms of his regular ranger duties, a deliberate act of re-establishing a semblance of normalcy. He checked trails, cleared fallen timber, and spoke to the occasional hiker with a detached politeness. But his eyes and ears were tuned differently now. Every rustle in the underbrush, every shift in the wind's direction, every anomaly in the pattern of animal behavior was noted, processed, filtered through his new understanding. He moved through the forest with a heightened awareness, his senses acutely sharpened by the knowledge of what truly lurked beyond human perception. For the next 3 months, an unsettling silence descended upon the Shugok. The creature did not appear on any of the few remaining discreetly placed game cameras Daniel had left out of habit. There were no more strange stone triangles, no more mysteriously toppled trees, no shadows on the edge of his vision, no unusual sounds that had no explanation from wind or animal. The forest on the surface reverted to its familiar, beautiful, yet desolate tranquility. But this was not the innocent silence of an empty wilderness. This was a pregnant silence, a watchful quiet, a stillness that spoke not of absence, but of an immense, knowing presence that had simply chosen to retreat into the deepest shadows. It was the quiet of a paused game, a held breath. During this period of eerie lull, Daniel spent countless hours in his cabin by the crackling wood stove contemplating the encounter. He dissected every detail, replaying the creature's ancient eyes, the dog's impossibly friendly whine. Why had it not attacked? Why had Jax reacted with such odd acceptance? What did the marks mean? He chewed over theories, discarding them one by one. Eventually, a chilling, profound idea began to take root. The creature, he concluded, had been testing him, assessing his intentions. It had chosen not to harm him, not to act aggressively because he had not posed a direct threat, and because Jax, his loyal, intuitive companion, had signaled something benign. It was an evaluation, a grim, silent examination of his presence in its domain. He found himself slowly, reluctantly, accepting the impossible. The Chugach National Forest was not merely a collection of trees, rocks, and animals. It was a living, breathing entity, an ancient, complex organism with its own rules, its own deep-seated forces. It had a guardian, an ancient, unseen protector that existed beyond the feeble grasp of human science, beyond conventional understanding. There were things in this world, he realized, that defied explanation, and attempting to control or fully comprehend them was not only futile but dangerously arrogant. His previous efforts felt childish, an ant trying to understand the mountain. Though the creature remained hidden, Daniel felt its invisible presence, a constant low hum beneath the surface of the forest. It was a quiet coexistence, living alongside a profoundly reclusive, incredibly powerful neighbor who rarely showed themselves, but whose existence permeated every aspect of your life. This unceasing, subtle vigilance was exhausting, yet it also honed his senses further, sharpening his connection to the forest to a spiritual level. He moved through the trees not just as a ranger, but as someone intimately aware of the ancient, powerful secrets held within its depths. He was no longer just an observer. He was, in a strange, terrifying way, becoming a part of the ecosystem, an extension of the forest's awareness. This period of quiet, Daniel knew, was not an end. It was a truce, a fragile, unspoken agreement. The balance was delicate, tenuous. Any threat to the forest, any significant violation of its unspoken ancient rules, could shatter this uneasy peace and reawaken its ancient defender. He lived with this knowledge now, a grim, solemn burden. His role in the forest had changed. He was no longer just the park ranger protecting the trails and the wildlife from human encroachment. He was now, in a terrifying, silent way, an unwitting participant in a deeper, more profound protection. A new, unacknowledged agent in the fragile balance between humanity and the primeval forces that lay hidden within the ancient heart of the Shugach. The quiet shattered with the jarring ring of Daniel's satellite phone. It was mid-morning, the sun a pale, watery disk above the peaks, casting long, thin shadows through the trees. For months, he'd lived in that uneasy truce, the silence of the forest a constant companion, albeit one imbued with a subtle, omnipresent dread. Now, that fragile peace was ripped apart. His supervisor's voice, rough with annoyance, came through the static. "Ranger Brooks, we've got trouble down south. Poachers, big time. Get down there." The old threat, forgotten amidst the greater, more terrifying mysteries of the forest, had reared its ugly head once more. And Daniel felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. This was not just a crime, it was a violation. But this time it was different. This was not the clumsy, isolated attempts of small-time hunters. Reports began to trickle in, then flow, of several groups of poachers operating with an unprecedented level of aggression. They were not just after deer and moose. They were brazen, violent. Several tourists, innocent hikers venturing off the main trails, had been found injured. Some had knife wounds, others were brutally beaten. This was not typical poaching behavior, which usually involved stealth and avoidance of confrontation. This was outright depravity, a terrifying new level of cruelty and disregard for human life. It spoke of desperation and a chilling thrill in the violence itself. And they were expanding. They were not confining themselves to the usual remote hunting grounds. These poachers, driven by greed and something darker, had spread out, pushing into new, previously undisturbed areas of the forest. They were violating the very invisible boundaries that Daniel had observed the creature respected, the ancient lines that separated the creature's domain. A sick feeling churned in his stomach. They were not just disrupting the fragile human order. They were, with every step, every brazen act of violence, deliberately provoking something far more ancient, far more terrifying. They were entering forbidden territory, pushing their luck with forces they could not even begin to comprehend. Daniel's job shifted, brutally, back to the familiar. His patrols were no longer about observing wildlife and maintaining trails. Now he was hunting men. He moved through the forest with a renewed grim purpose, his senses on high alert. He followed their crude trails, noting the carelessly discarded cigarette butts, the empty shell casings glinting dully on the moss, the rough-hewn camps left behind. It was a haunting echo of another time, another place, a return to the chilling familiarity of tracking insurgents through the harsh, unforgiving landscapes of Iraq. The smell of stale wood smoke, cheap tobacco, and human refuse hung heavy in the air, a noxious counterpoint to the clean scent of pine. The specter of 1,000 similar missions whispered in the back of his mind, a painful yet useful memory. His father's lessons, combined with his army training, now came to the fore with brutal efficiency. He read the land an open book, each subtle sign a sentence in a grim narrative. A scuffed boot print in the damp earth, the precise depth and tread pattern telling him how many men, how recently. An imperceptible scratch on a tree bark, a broken twig, a disturbed patch of moss, All offered a silent testimony. He pieced together their routes, their habits, their numbers. He tasted their desperation, their arrogance, their crude violence on the wind. He moved a shadow, silent and unseen, a shadow stalking shadows. His every muscle was tuned, every nerve on edge, the familiar rhythm of the hunt filling him with a cold, clear focus. Every night he spent in pursuit, every mile he tracked pulled him closer to an inevitable, violent collision. He felt the threads of fate tightening around him, a grim certainty settling in his bones. The forest, usually his silent confidant, now was a vast, tense stage where a terrible drama was about to unfold. Jax, usually calm and steadfast, began to display an unnerving anxiety. The husky paced restlessly in the cabin at night, its ears swiveling, its nose twitching at invisible stimuli. It emitted a low, guttural growl, directed at something unseen in the dense darkness beyond the cabin walls. A warning meant for Daniel, a confirmation of the chilling dread that now clung to them both. The dog's unease spoke volumes, amplifying Daniel's own fear, confirming that the balance had been irrevocably disturbed, and the forest, which held its own ancient secrets, was about to react. The scent of stale wood smoke and unwashed bodies hung heavy in the air, a foul stench that cut through the crisp pine. After days of relentless, agonizing tracking, Daniel finally stumbled upon their camp. It was not planned. The forest had been too dense, the shadows too deep, for a clean approach. He rounded a thicket of hemlock, and there they were. 3 men, silhouetted against the dying embers of a small fire, their faces hard and wary, their rifles propped carelessly against a makeshift lean-to. The element of surprise was lost. Before Daniel could react, before he could even draw his sidearm, one of them, younger, quicker, spotted him. A shout tore through the quiet, followed by the sickening roar of a rifle shot. The world exploded into chaos. Daniel instinctively dropped, rolling behind the meager cover of a fallen log, the sound of bullets whipping through the air above him, splintering wood. And then Jax. The loyal husky, his only constant, his silent guardian, did not hesitate. With a guttural bark, a desperate, defiant cry, the dog launched himself forward, a blur of gray and white, directly at the source of the gunfire, lunging for the legs of the nearest poacher. It was an act of pure, selfless protection, a desperate attempt to draw fire, to shield his master. In the rapid exchange of gunfire, amidst the sudden deafening chaos, Daniel saw it. A flash of muzzle fire, a sickening thud, and Jax, mid-air, twisted unnaturally. A short, heartbreaking yelp cut off abruptly, and then a heavy, lifeless thud as his best friend, his brother, his shadow, collapsed to the earth. The world narrowed to that single, horrible image. Jax lying still, a dark stain blossoming rapidly on his beautiful fur. A scream, raw and animalistic, tore from Daniel's throat, but it was unheard, lost in the ringing in his ears. This was not just a dog. This was the only connection he had left, the sole, warm, living presence in a life consumed by painful memories. The pain of loss was a physical blow, sharper, more searing than any bullet. It consumed him, a white-hot wave of grief and pure, unadulterated rage. He blindly brought up his pistol, the cold steel familiar, a natural extension of his arm. He fired, not with precision, but with a wild, desperate fury, targeting the men who had stolen his last piece of solace. A searing pain blossomed in his left shoulder, a dull, crushing impact that spun him around. A bullet. It had found him. But the pain, profound as it was, was a distant echo compared to the agony in his heart. He felt the warm, sticky gush of blood, but he ignored it. He heard a cry from one of the poachers, a grunt of pain, a rifle clattering to the ground. He had hit one of them. But then, as he struggled to bring his rifle back up, the remaining poachers, taking advantage of his wound, his momentary paralysis of grief, melted back into the shadows, disappearing as silently and swiftly as they had appeared. Left alone in the sudden ringing silence, Daniel crawled to Jack's, his good hand reaching out, trembling to touch the still warm fur. The tears came hot and bitter, mingling with the cold sweat and blood on his face. He stayed there for a long time, the weight of his grief pressing him into the cold earth. Eventually his training kicked in, the grim lessons of survival overriding his anguish. He had to get out. He had to live. He managed to drag himself, half crawling, half stumbling towards his truck, the pain in his shoulder a dull, relentless throb. He fumbled for his satellite phone, his fingers slick with blood, and made the emergency call, his voice hoarse, barely coherent. The blare of sirens, distant at first, then growing louder, was the last thing he remembered before darkness claimed him. He woke in the antiseptic white of a hospital room, the fluorescent lights harsh against his raw eyes. The smell of disinfectant, of sterile sheets, of sick humanity, filled his nostrils. Away from the wild, from the ancient trees, from the comforting silence of the forest, he felt an even deeper, more profound loneliness. The aching absence of Jack's, the imagined weight of the dog against his legs, was a constant, aching void. The nightmares returned with a vengeance, a horrifying montage of desert dust and the sound of his dog's last, dying whimper. He had lost everything that mattered, everything that kept him tethered to the living world. When he was finally discharged, a sling on his shoulder, his body weak but his spirit hardened, he learned the inevitable. The poachers had vanished. Again. The police, their voices filled with bureaucratic resignation, talked about the vastness of the forest, the difficulty of tracking in such terrain. They were gone, unseen figures, leaving no trace. Daniel's grief, a raw wound, began to morph, slowly, inexorably, into a cold, burning, all-consuming thirst for retribution. He had lost his last friend, and now there was only one path left. The hospital had been a sterile purgatory, a place of enforced idleness and simmering rage. Daniel did not think about healing. He did not think about recovery. His mind, stripped bare of all other concerns, fixed on a singular burning purpose: finding them. Finding the men who had stolen his last anchor, who had ripped the last piece of light from his world. Vengeance for Jack's was not merely a desire. It was a consuming, visceral need, a cold fire that burned away all pain, all fatigue. He returned to the Chugach, his shoulder still throbbing, his gait uneven, but his eyes were sharp, cold and utterly resolute. He was ready to go to the end. He became the hunter he once was, honed by war and the unforgiving wilderness, now driven by a singular, merciless obsession. The police might have given up, but they did not know the forest as he did. They had not lived for months with heightened senses, tracking an unseen, intelligent entity. Daniel picked up their faint, imperceptible trail where the official search teams had lost it. He saw the smallest disturbances in the moss, the displaced pebbles, the faint sheen of a disturbed spider web across a narrow game path. He noted the way a branch had been unnaturally bent, the faint, acrid smell of a discarded cigarette. He pieced together their route, each tiny detail a breadcrumb leading him deeper into the wild heart of the forest. He moved a shadow, silent and unseen, a shadow stalking shadows. His every muscle was tuned, every nerve on edge, the familiar rhythm of the hunt filling him with a cold, clear focus. After days of relentless, punishing pursuit, pushing his body beyond exhaustion, Daniel found their camp. It was nestled in a remote, rocky hollow, a place shielded by ancient trees and a small, ice-cold stream. The tents were still standing, their drab canvas flapping in the cold breeze, but their condition sent a shiver down his spine. They were haphazardly pitched, gear scattered outside, the remnants of a fire still visible. All the signs screamed of a hasty, panicked abandonment. But not, he realized with a chilling certainty, because of his approach. The smell hit him first, even before he stepped inside. A rank, cloying odor of death and decay, far worse than anything he had encountered before. He pushed aside the flap of the largest tent, his hand already on his sidearm, though a part of him knew with bone-deep certainty that it would not be needed. Inside, the scene was a grotesque tableau. A satellite phone, its screen cracked, lay abandoned on a sleeping bag. And then, the true horror. Strewn across the floor on top of muddy tarps were guts. Not animal entrails, but human organs partially consumed, mixed with pools of congealed, blackening blood. The sheer quantity of blood, its sticky metallic smell overpowering, indicated a colossal, monstrous slaughter. The air was thick with it, a tangible presence of death. He gagged, the sour taste of bile in his throat, his mind screaming in mute horror. He backed away, staggering, into the open air, fighting the nausea. The cold wind against his face did little to clear the stench. He stumbled out of the camp, his eyes scanning the frozen earth around him. And there, in the thin layer of late-season snow that dusted the clearing, he saw the most horrifying evidence of all. Tracks. First, the clear, terrified imprints of human boots, deep and frantic, sometimes stumbling, sometimes running. And then, intermingled with them, overlaying them, the immense, unmistakable prints of a colossal clawed paw. They alternated, a horrifying, silent dance in the snow. Human, then beast, human, then beast. The tracks told a story of a desperate chase, a brutal, inevitable end. 100 yards from the camp, scattered through the undergrowth, he found the final chilling pieces, tattered fragments of clothing, ripped and shredded, caught on branches, clinging to the rough bark of trees. A torn piece of a flannel shirt, a boot with a sole ripped clean off, a single bloody glove. In that moment, staring at those tracks, at those pathetic remnants, Daniel understood. The poachers had not vanished. They had not escaped. They had met the same fate as the grizzly, and as the first group of men whose remains he had found. The guardian of the forest, unseen and inexorable, had delivered its ancient, terrible justice. It was not a bear. It was the creature, the same entity he had seen on camera, the one that had looked at him with ancient eyes, the one that Jax had acknowledged with an inexplicable familiarity. The werewolf, the ancient, primeval protector of the Shugash, and the final chilling detail. Just as with the bear, just as with the first slaughtered men, the ground around the campsite was eerily, unnervingly clean. Despite the grotesque carnage, despite the disemboweled bodies, there were no vast pools of blood, no splatters coating the surrounding trees. It had all been taken, consumed, spirited away by whatever monstrous force had wrought this devastation. His dog was avenged. But the grim satisfaction was overshadowed by a profound, terrible awe and a bitter disappointment. It had not been his hand that had delivered justice. It had been something far older, far more powerful, something that confirmed his deepest fears, and yet offered a strange, unsettling clarity to his new, solitary existence. The cold, still air hummed with the lingering resonance of what had happened. Daniel stood amidst the carnage, the stench of blood and decay thick in his nostrils, and a grim resolve settled over him. He knew with absolute certainty what had to be done. There would be no calling the authorities, no summoning of search parties or investigators. The truth, raw and terrifying, was for him alone to bear. He began methodically to erase it. He gathered everything that served as evidence, everything that could lead official eyes to this unholy sight. The tattered remnants of clothing, the broken pieces of equipment, the dismembered remains of the poachers themselves. He piled them into the abandoned lean-to, along with the tattered tents, the cracked satellite phone, and the few discarded personal effects. Then, with a cold, ritualistic precision, he produced a lighter. The flame, small and insignificant in the vastness of the forest, flickered to life, then caught the dry canvas. The fire grew swiftly, greedily, devouring the evidence, sending thick plumes of acrid smoke spiraling upwards into the cold Alaskan sky. The crackle and hiss of the burning material, the sickening smell of scorched flesh and melting plastic, filled the air. He watched, unblinking, as the flames consumed the last vestiges of the horror, leaving behind only ash and the lingering scent of cremation. He would leave nothing, absolutely nothing, that could ever lead police to this place. When the fire had died down to glowing embers, Daniel began the arduous task of obliterating his own tracks. He spent hours meticulously brushing away his boot prints from the soft earth, rearranging fallen leaves and pine needles, leaving the ground as undisturbed as he had found it. He knew the tricks, the subtle signs that gave away a human presence, and he eliminated each one with a practiced hand. He then returned to his cabin, and with a series of deliberate, precise actions, he erased his digital footprint. He wiped the logs from the few cameras he had left active, ensured no coordinates of his recent movements were stored on his global positioning system unit, and purged his satellite phone of any recent call history. Every bit of information, every digital shadow that connected him to the events, was systematically, irrevocably destroyed. He did not call for backup. He did not seek counsel. He did not even consider it. He knew, with bone-deep certainty, that no one would believe him. The story he carried, the horrifying truth of the forest's ancient guardian, was too preposterous, too chilling to be spoken aloud. It would be met with skepticism, with pity, with the casual dismissal that had always plagued his efforts to bring attention to the anomalies here. He was alone with this knowledge, burdened by its immensity, yet strangely resolute. This secret, vast and terrible, was now his to carry, a heavy, silent weight upon his shoulders. He returned to his ranger cabin, exhausted, his body aching, but with a new, chilling clarity in his mind. The cabin was emptier now, the silence more profound, deafening without the comforting presence of Jax. His life had changed, irrevocably and profoundly. He was no longer simply a park ranger, maintaining trails and observing wildlife. He was now inextricably bound to this ancient land, a silent participant in its dark, primeval order. Daniel remained in the park, continuing his duties. His solitude deepened, yes, but it was now imbued with a grim, chilling purpose. He patrolled the trails, not just looking for loose markers and signs of human intrusion, but for something more. He watched the boundaries, listened to the deep hum of the forest, ever vigilant for any disturbance to the fragile, terrifying balance that now defined his existence. He was not the only one protecting this vast wilderness. He knew that now with an undeniable certainty. But he was one of its chosen few, a silent sentinel, an unwitting partner to the ancient unseen force that governed its deepest secrets. He was in the Chugach National Forest, Daniel Brooks, the new, unwilling, and forever haunted guardian of the unseen.